So I was recently on this newest Jubilee video, which apparently is a new series they're starting called Checkmate, which is essentially a debate-style game show where you can fact-check your opponents live. And I debated against Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire's newest hire, Matt Nuclear. If you're unfamiliar with who Matt Nuclear is, he's essentially this up-and-coming young Zionist debater, and Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire are hiring him essentially to keep American Zionism afloat. They understand that Gen Z and Gen Z conservatives especially are becoming increasingly Israel critical. And so Matt is there to serve as, the propaganda tool to keep American Zionism within right-wing politics alive and well, right? To showcase that Zionism can be a cool debate strategy in the same way that Ben Shapiro used to do it, way back when he was actually a popular political figure on the right, or at least dominated the right-wing political media space in a way that he doesn't currently now. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this debate, and you're going to see quickly how Matt just gets humiliated on the fact check, but also if you dissect his arguments, he's really not that smart, right? If you actually go through what this guy is saying, it's pretty grotesque what it actually means morally and ethically, but it's also just not that intelligent of an argument. So we're going to go through that, and then I also want to show you some of the aftermath in our interactions on Twitter, because it also displays, I think, how cowardly and how dishonest and disingenuous Matt is as an individual, the way that he clips and crops things for his own benefit, for propaganda purposes, and then the way that he totally dodges addressing, the legitimate points that I either made in this debate or on Twitter, as you'll come to find out. So without further ado, let's jump into it.
All right, so I think that we're going to have to specify this conversation a little bit more when we're talking about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So we're going to probably have like an area of specificity. We're really discussing policy and who did better. So I'm going to start off with talking about foreign policy. So in reference to Trump, he obviously took out Maduro, brought him to America, made the government there obsequious with Desi Rodriguez, that is essentially now more open to investment, more open to freeing up Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. In reference to the short-term conflict that existed, for example, basically like a blitz conflict that existed between Pakistan and India, where things could have really escalated. Pakistan nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Furthermore, when it comes to something...
It's worth noting that India insisted that Donald Trump had no part in making peace between that blitz conflict between India and Pakistan, but I digress. Very interesting, by the way, that you'll notice Matt lists all these foreign policy achievements for Donald Trump, but doesn't actually mention the Iran war, which is obviously something that I quickly bring up. But an important thing to note prior to us getting even further into this video is the debate topic is whose presidential record is better, Biden or Trump? And you're going to see why that actually matters here in a moment.
Very important is rare earth minerals. In reference to Rwanda and the DRC, obviously Trump was able to get a short-term ceasefire between them and also get some concessions when it comes to rare earth minerals. When it comes to the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand, Trump was also able to get them to stop fighting with the threat of sanctions, and also received, I believe, a Nobel Peace Prize from specifically Cambodia, but I may be wrong on whether or not it's Cambodia or Thailand. We saw the Abraham Accords happen.
All right. Okay. Time is up.
Sure.
It's also worth mentioning that part of the reason, or seemingly intuitively, right, we can infer the reason why Matt believes all of these foreign policy achievements to be a great part of Donald Trump's record is because preventing conflict and ensuring peace ensures the survival of people who otherwise would have died if these conflicts erupted into war, right? That is also relevant when assessing whose presidential record is worse, Biden or Trump. Now, I'm very critical of the Biden administration, but because Joe Biden did not get us into this insane war with Iran, it unequivocally does make Joe Biden's record a bit better than Donald Trump on the foreign policy stage.
Now, Evan, it's time for your one uninterrupted minute. Your time starts now.
Great. So I'm glad that you brought up foreign policy, because you're leaving out a pretty critical foreign policy decision by the Trump administration, and that was to engage in a war of choice and a war of aggression on Iran that got 13 U.S. servicemen killed. So Donald Trump, through a decision, not a decision that he had to make, but a deliberate decision, a decision that he was actually talked into by people like Bibi Netanyahu, the head of Mossad, on earlier this year, I think it was in February in the White House conference room, made that choice, got 13 U.S. servicemen killed over 1,600 Iranian civilians, and then also has created now inflation with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is something that you would expect to happen when starting a war with Iran. Now inflation outpaces wage growth, and the inflation is global. So the global catastrophic consequences, according to organizations such as the World Food Program, is going to create millions of more people to be in sort of insecure.
All right, we gotta pause it here.
So obviously I didn't get to totally finish what I was saying, but a big part of why this war in Iran is disastrous is because of the global inflation effects. And this not only affects the American working class here at home, the American working class that was already struggling prior to Donald Trump getting elected. In fact, that was a huge reason why Donald Trump got elected. So you'd think that the Trump administration would care about something like inflation, but now inflation is outpacing wage growth. It's wiping out wage growth gains in various sectors, but inflation is also a global phenomenon, right? And so the World Food Program recently reported that millions of more people are now expected to face acute food insecurity because of this rapid inflation, especially for things like fertilizer that have been drastically impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And the longer this closure goes on for, because Donald Trump can't figure out how to actually get it back open and make the necessary concessions, considering the United States has lost strategic leverage through this war. Now, those consequences are going to be felt by millions of people abroad, right? So if your argument is essentially that Donald Trump is a peacemaker, he's saving all of these lives by ending these conflicts, even if I were to grant that, right, I'm able to point to a very specific instance in which Donald Trump's choice, a war of aggression on Iran, has pushed millions of people into food insecurity, and in addition to hurting the American working class, and that is on top of all of the obvious human toll that comes with war, such as the death of Iranian civilians, as well as the death of U.S. servicemen.
Your time is up. All right, now I'm gonna put the checkmate button in between you guys. Remember, this button can only be pressed once, so make sure you're right. No pressure.
No pressure.
All right, sudden death begins. We're gonna start with Matt, and your time starts now.
Thanks. So you mentioned like a war choice. I think the majority of conflicts in America, obviously, a war choice. I think that when we engage in foreign policy or in foreign conflicts, it's always of choice. The question really is about whether or not it's something necessary, something for the good of presidents, or for the good of country, good of morality. Hold on, I just want to say something else. You tried to imply that, like, well, he got 13 U.S. members killed. That's like me saying that, for example, FDR got hundreds of thousands of Americans killed, right? Or Truman got hundreds of thousands of Americans killed.
FDR, by the way, if he's referring to World War II, were we attacked first for World War II? We didn't get involved in World War II until we were attacked first. And you can make the argument that because our allies abroad within Europe were facing an existential threat that we should have got involved. But that includes a legitimate existential threat, right? That includes Germany invading Poland, invading its neighbors. So even if you want to suggest we should have gotten involved sooner, we didn't get involved sooner. In fact, we got involved in World War II after we attacked. That's not a deliberate, that's not what we mean by war of choice. By war of choice, we mean that Donald Trump and the Trump administration did not exhaust diplomatic efforts in this case to achieve their military or strategic objectives, or at least what is stated by the administration. I think that it's pretty clear if you follow what the administration was espousing prior to the war, they were intending for something like regime change, but then they post hoc changed the military objectives to something lesser than, which they still hadn't even achieved. But nonetheless, this idea that every war is a war of choice and that there can't be legitimate wars of self-defense that are by their very nature not of choice is a stupid argument.
I don't think that presidents go into war to get Americans killed. I think that presidents go into war to try to complete a geopolitical objective that they believe is moral and just.
Okay, so I want to circle back. Do you agree, though, that war should be a last resort?
I believe that, yes. I think generally speaking, war we should try to do it.
And what is the objective of this war?
Well, the objective of this war obviously has been to be the depletion of the Iranian government's missile stockpile, their naval stockpile.
Do you believe that they've gotten rid of most of their missile stockpile?
No, that was my claim. My claim was that there was a depletion.
Notice how he says that, because that's actually something that you'll want to also keep in mind before the end of this video. Is I asked him, okay, what are some of the objectives of this war? He said the depletion of their missile stockpile, which I don't understand why that's even a good military objective. If it's a stockpile that they can just essentially rebuild. Right? That we haven't actually solved this missile stockpile. I mean, there's been a depletion of our interceptors as well. Are we just starting wars, killing people, doing something that's very costly that we're just going to again have to deal with in 10, 20 years? So he hasn't actually demonstrated why that's even a good military objective. But I ask him, have we even depleted a majority of their missile stockpile? He initially says no, but then that later changes at the end of the video.
And for example, I wanted to go on to answer
how much of a depletion?
I want to go on to answer some of your.
Well, I'm asking you.
About the nuclear weapons.
You said.
So we also on further.
You agree that
in furtherance of that, we've also bombed Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan nuclear facilities in Iran,
right.
and that has also depleted obviously their nuclear capacities to a certain extent. Sure. That's on top of destroying their destroyer in the Indian Ocean, so on and so forth.
You said at the beginning of this that you agreed with me that war should be a last resort to achieve objectives. One of the objectives you laid out.
Yes.
One of the objectives you laid out was degrading Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, and
nope, wrong.
Okay, so
I said like their nuclear capacity. There's different things that.
Capabilities versus capacity, that seems like just a silly semantic distinction.
Nuclear capacity, and
right.
but
by destroying the facilities.
Right, but you would agree though that their nuclear capabilities were degraded prior to the JCPOA relative to when Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. They enriched to 60% enrichment, which is closer to weapons grade uranium after Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, and that would be a form of multilateral negotiations. In other words, diplomacy worked in limiting their nuclear enrichment more so than just pulling out of the JCPOA and engaging in hard sanctions.
So far, I need people to understand what's happening. So far, he's listed two things that were military objectives that we needed to achieve with Iran. One of them was a degradation of their missile capabilities, or their missile stockpile rather. He's incapable, at least at this point in the debate, of actually giving me an estimate of how much that's actually been degraded, which seems silly to me to list that off as an objective that's actually been achieved. And then the other one was a degradation of their nuclear enrichment capabilities or capacity, right? But even he admits that the Islamic Republic of Iran today is closer to weapons grade uranium, and that their nuclear enrichment capabilities are actually increased today relative to what they were under the JCPOA. And because Donald Trump pulled us out of that and got us to a place where they're now at 60% enriched uranium, that's actually a tally against Trump on his record, which again is a part of the debate topic.
You would agree though that's in fact the case,
so my argument that I gave was that it was multifaceted. We didn't go into this war to complete one objective. For example, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, very much specified that the reason why we're going in now actually is because their missile stockpile is the largest in the Middle East, and that if we were to go in like later on to enforce something, that it'd be a lot tougher. Hold on. I let you go on for a second. Calm down. I let you go on for a second. Please let me finish.
Go on, Matt.
Right, and so that is one of the issue that a lot of like anti-JCPOA people bring up is like one thing, which is nuclear weapons. I get that that's the biggest fear factor. That's the biggest thing mentioned by Iran. But Iran is I
don't know what he means by just anti-JCPOA advocates. That is the primary thing that Donald Trump consistently refers to as to why we got into a war with Iran. He says they can't have a nuclear weapon. We're preventing them from having a nuclear weapon. They're committing to not having a nuclear weapon. By the way, their commitment to never have a nuclear weapon is already stated policy by the Islamic Republic, both in their domestic policy, but also in the preamble of the first page of the JCPOA. It literally says the Islamic Republic will not obtain or ever obtain a nuclear weapon.
Multi-faceted, sophisticated threat, not just nuclear weapons, the funding of proxy groups in obviously Yemen, in Gaza, the Houthis, for example, Hezbollah. All of these different groups create different effects and different wars that cost different countries expenditures. The Yemeni civil war, for example.
And again, we're noticing a large pivot, right? Now he's talking about the funding of proxies in the region. Is he going to be able to demonstrate that the United States has at all achieved that military objective by stopping the Islamic Republic Republic from funding proxies? Well, according to the MOU, we're actually supposed to be lifting sanctions and unfreezing Iranian assets. They're totally free to spend that money however they please, with no restrictions or no concessions rather, that's been given on them under this memorandum of understanding, which is ultimately the outcome of this disastrous war.
Killed thousands upon thousands of people in 2011, and that was heightened by Iran's support for obviously the Yemen.
And yet this war got zero concessions both on their missile capabilities and zero concessions on their funding of proxies.
You don't need concessions if you can just bomb shit.
So
you can just
no longer war is a last resort. We just ought to bomb them, right?
Right. So
killing 1,600 Iranian civilians, starting this war that has led to inflation now outpacing wage growth, inflation that has led to millions of more people in the global south being affected by acute food insecurity.
Right.
Yeah, those are all things.
Quick question.
You've engaged in all of those things, and you haven't even achieved two of the objectives that you just laid out. And the third objective, when it came to nuclear capabilities, that was achieved more so through diplomacy than it was through war. I would love to hear why.
You mentioned the 1,600 civilians. Just a rhetorical question. I don't want to go on a tangent on it. But you care about the lives of 1,600 civilians, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what happened between, for example, late December to early January, going through January? For example, in major cities like Tehran and Isfahan.
There were repressive and horrific crackdowns.
How many people, civilians died then, by the way?
I'm sure in the tens of thousands.
Oh, so a lot more. So why didn't you mention those tens of thousands, but only mention
because we're talking about Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
You care about those civilians, though, right?
I'm sorry, I'm not comparing the record of Ayatollah Khamenei versus.
Why
Donald
not?
Trump.
You don't care about the oppressing of civilians? You're a leftist. Your whole thing is social justice.
So because we're debating the prompt Donald Trump versus Joe Biden.
Do you see how unbelievably disingenuous he is? What relevance does the fact that however many people Khamenei has either tortured or killed, or horrific things that I completely disagree with, not only disagree with, these were all things that I had been speaking out about at the moment that these protests were happening. You can go back on my page. I co-created a video with an Iranian content creator friend of mine. I reposted consistently information about what was happening with the horrific crackdowns. So I don't know what he's suggesting, that I may be somehow implicated in being silent on this, but moreover, the debate topic is literally Joe Biden's record versus Donald Trump's record. If your concern is about Iranian civilians, who of those two presidents has killed way more Iranian civilians? The answer is clearly Donald Trump, right? Iran is not, and the people of Iran, the civilians of Iran that you supposedly care so deeply about, are in a worse position after this war. Not only are hundreds of them, not only have hundreds of them been killed, but also the United States and Israel struck oil depots and energy infrastructure in the region, where you had black smog suspending in Tehran's air for days on end, things that is eventually going to show up in health statistics for years and decades to come. I mean, horrific conditions are being enforced on the Iranian people. They're obviously going through, again, internet blackouts and even further crackdowns, considering their state is under martial law, because once again, the United States and Israel started a war of aggression on them. The Iranian population and the civilian population are under worse conditions now as a consequence of this war than they were prior to the war. So it doesn't make any sense in the context of the debate between Joe Biden's record and Donald Trump's record to just bring up what Khamenei did, when very, very clearly Donald Trump's policies against Iran have been much worse for the Iranian people.
Civilians being killed.
So Donald Trump
care about that.
Yeah. So Joe Biden did not make a decision that got 13 U.S. servicemen killed, 1,600 additional.
How many were killed during the fallout?
If you think it's so horrific,
killed during the fallout of Afghanistan?
If you think it's so horrific for tens of thousands of Iranian civilians to be massacred by their own government, why don't you think it's horrific when thousands of or hundreds of Iranian civilians are killed by the United States military? Do you think it was horrific when a U.S. Tomahawk missile struck a girls' school in Manab, Iran, and Donald Trump can't even admit fault for that? He attempted to suggest that the U.S. Tomahawk missile might have been from one of our adversaries.
Right, so can I respond to that?
Yeah. And some context to why that is insane for Donald Trump to suggest, the Tomahawk missile, yeah, well, a lot of countries have Tomahawk missiles. It might have been one of our adversaries. That's an insane admission, because it's only the United States and U.S. allies that have Tomahawk missiles. So for Donald Trump to admit that, it's a method of him post hoc trying to cast blame somewhere else and not take fault for the drastic, catastrophic mistake of striking a little girls' school and killing over 116 Iranian school children. That is something that this administration not only hasn't taken fault for and hasn't taken blame for, something that we would never, ever suggest is in any way acceptable, even if it was done as a quote unquote accident or by negligence by one of our adversaries, right? This administration refuses to take any sort of accountability for that. And that goes to show you how little they disregard for the lives of people that they kill abroad.
Yeah, so during war, there's something called civilian casualties during conflict.
Oh my God.
And so in every single war, laugh it off.
Yeah, and during...
Let me ask you this, Matt. Do you think if Iran had struck a girls' school in the United States and it would just happen to be based on negligence, they just had, bad intelligence about where a base was or what have you, would you be sitting here telling me that that was just, casualties of war and that we should accept casualties of war considering this is a war that we actually started? Is that, do you think that him or any of the conservatives that advocated for this war would be saying the same thing if it was American girls on an American base in the United States and it was an Iran missile that hit those children because of negligence? None of them would do that. We all know the answer to that question.
Yeah, let me respond, please. Appreciate it. Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference between, like, for example, that at least you got it right, Manab, Iran, specifically a coastal city in Iran. That school was right next to what? And on what day, by the way?
Okay.
So right next to a naval base. Right next to a naval base, and it was actually on Saturday.
We don't have schools on bases in the United States.
Can I finish?
Do we not have? Do we have schools on bases in the United States?
I'm going to add context to what I just said as well.
So it's a yes or no question. Do we have schools on bases in the United States?
Calm down. So I'm adding context to what actually happened.
To answer this
because I think that when we're talking about civilians dying during conflict,
and that just goes to show you how unbelievably disgusting and disingenuous Matt Nuclear is. When he asked me questions about what Khamenei did and whether or not the Islamic Republic imposed brutal crackdowns on their people and how many people died, I answered those questions and I condemned it and I in no way attempted to defend it. But when it comes to a U.S. Tomahawk missile striking a girls' school in Manab, Iran, what is his deflection? That it was on a Saturday? That U.S. intelligence doesn't know that there might be children at a school on a Saturday in Iran? In what way do you think that a military that is so unbelievably stupid and negligent to do that is going to be competent in its broader strategy? That's the ridiculous nature and the ridiculous logic of these warmongers, right? But moreover, he then suggests, well, that school was next to an IRGC naval base, okay? Somehow casting blame on the Iranian people for those deaths, right? That's the insinuation that they shouldn't have schools on bases. Well, the United States does in fact have schools on bases across the world, and I believe in America as well. So is that an argument? Is that something that he would accept? And there's a reason, very clear reason why he refused to answer that question, right? And insists that I'm just interrupting him and never proceeds to answer that later on, which I wish I had grilled him on further. But because this is supposed to be a fact-centered discussion, and in order for me to quote unquote win the debate, I'm supposed to catch him on an empirical claim, I ended up pivoting to that something later, which I did end up catching him on. But it's still unbelievably disgusting and disingenuous that Matt refuses to answer the question, does the United States have schools on bases?
Let me finish. Got to be back and forth here.
Well, it's
so
a yes or no
we're talking about civilians dying during conflict. An important thing that we should focus on is the intent. Is the government that is actually conducting these airstrikes trying to mitigate civilian harm, or are they being negligent? So the factors were not only that it was obviously right next to a naval base,
horrific?
And on top of that, you're interrupting me again, right? It was also on a Saturday, so there's also like cultural factors on whether or not on why they would think that there probably isn't a school day, right? Because in America we typically don't have school days on Saturdays, right?
Would you agree? Wait, so the negligence of these people not knowing whether...
Which, by the way, even though we don't have school days on Saturdays, there is certainly Saturday school at various schools across the country, but there's also still students sometimes at school on a Saturday for extracurricular activities, for sports or what have you. I mean, the idea that if we struck this school and there even wasn't children there, or not very many children, and it wasn't a particular school day that day, it would still be wrong and horrific. It's still bad. It is still horrific to target civilian infrastructure, even if there was nobody there, right? It's still a bad thing to do, and you shouldn't do that. So the idea that whether or not America's military knew that there was a school day on a Saturday in Iran, to me, feels like one of the most pathetic excuses and defenses for something that's obviously a stain on this administration, and something that none of these so-called moral arbiters can admit to.
Or not there's children in a school in Iran on a Saturday.
Wars aren't perfect.
Yeah,
That's how wars work. Name a single war without accidental civilian casualties.
Yeah, well,
or for example, friendly fire happening.
But this is why, circling back, why war has to be a last resort. And you can't even demonstrate that the United States has achieved any of its war
haven't responded.
So
I have actually. Depletion of the missile stockpile.
How much of the missile?
I'm not going to put a number on it.
Yeah, exactly. So if one missile was depleted, is that considered a depletion?
So can I respond?
If one missile was depleted,
can I respond?
how many? Give me an estimate. Give me a percentage estimate.
If I give you a percentage, will you estimate it? Estimates over 50%.
Okay.
Fact check it.
Evan, so I see that you pushed the button in sudden death. So this is serious. All right, what claim would you like to fact check?
U.S. classified intel reports, as reported by the New York Times.
No, just say what you're saying.
And this also just shows insecurity. Like, if you're so concrete and secure about your position, let me provide the source, because I'm obviously clearly more familiar with the information than you are. I mean, Matt Nuclear insists, right? He insists that we have, in fact, achieved many of our strategic objectives. One of the objectives he says we achieved was a depletion of our missile stockpile. If you're so confident in that fact, then you should be willing to contend with whatever sourcing I'm willing to bring up, or you should have sourcing of your own. But I have sourcing because I know what I'm talking about in this instance.
70%
What's
of
the
Iran's
claim, though?
My claim was that Iran's missile stockpile has been depleted
by 50%.
Hold on. By more, I specifically said more than.
And then he insists more than 50%. Yeah, I don't know why he thinks that that's going against what I'm about to say. I think he thought that I was going to try to catch him on a technicality. No, what I'm suggesting is it's only been depleted by 30% according to U.S. intelligence. And we're actually going to jump over to that article here in a second. But just like notice his insistent confidence that it must be over 50%. And then he bitches and whines at the end when the fact check ends up suggesting that at most it's been 50%, but other reports suggest much lower.
50%.
Good. Okay.
Boom. That's it.
Okay. Mine is that they maintain 70% of their missile stockpile, as reported by the New York Times, according to a classified.
Which would be a depletion of 30%, for those of you who can't do math.
Classified report.
Okay, we'll see.
Yep. So more than that's according to a classified report.
Let them find it.
I'm just giving them where they can look to find the information.
Let them find it. They're the fact.
Yeah, he's so insecure about losing, because he obviously ended up doing that. But like, dude, if you're confident in your ability to debate the facts, it shouldn't matter what sources other people bring up. You shouldn't be insecure about the source, or you should rather allow your opponents to look up if you're so confident in your position on a specific empirical claim.
Checkers, that's their job, right?
It's your job to play for your home team.
Classify things.
I mean,
Would you want them? I'd rather them be correct, personally.
the New York Times might have said that, and it might be wrong.
Well, if it's a classified FBI report, that's from the government.
So you have to look at
The FBI
classified.
could be wrong. I don't know.
All right, Matt, during our sudden death debate, you claimed that Iran's missile stockpile has decreased more than 50% since the start of the war. Our fact checkers have checked, and they've come to a verdict. And that is a false claim. Reports state Iran's missile stockpile has decreased by at best 50% since the start of the war. Other estimates put it much lower.
50%.
See, now he bitches about it. Like, he's like, what 50? They said at 50% at most. But just a few minutes earlier, he's insistent. I said more than 50%. Well, Matt, if you're so insistent that your claim is that it was more than 50%, you can't bitch and moan when the fact check says at best it was 50%, right? You're so specific on the claim a few minutes earlier, but now he bitches and moans that he is wrong, even at the best estimates according to him. So that was the aftermath, right? Or that was the video, rather. Now I do want to jump into the aftermath. But before doing that, I do want to show you the report that I was specifically referring to. So this is out of the New York Times. It says, U.S. intelligence shows Iran maintains substantial missile capabilities. Secret new assessments say Iran has operational access to 30 of its 33 missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. Additionally, if you scroll down, it says, Iran still fields about 70% of its mobile launchers across the country and has retained roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile, according to the assessments. So this is according to a U.S. intelligence assessment, right? The Trump administration's public portrayal of a shattered Iranian military is sharply at odds with what U.S. intelligence agencies are telling policymakers behind closed doors. According to classified assessments from early this month that show Iran has regained access to most of its missile sites and launchers and underground facilities. Most alarming to senior officials is evidence that Iran has restored operational access to 30 of its 33 missile sites. So in other words, 30 of its 33 missile sites have continued to be operational, and they still have 70% of their pre-war missile stockpile. And Matt believes that that is worth, that the depletion of 30% of their missile stockpile and the depletion of only 3 of their 33 missile launchers was worth getting 13 U.S. servicemen killed, was worth starting this disastrous inflation that has affected everyone from the American working class to people in the global south, was totally worth killing 1,600 Iranian civilians over and damaging civilian infrastructure in the region, was totally worth getting U.S. bases hit, which is something that we never even touched on, which is worth spending exorbitant amounts of money on this war, and what is totally worth allowing Israel to, invade southern Lebanon and deplete our own capabilities when it comes to conventional military capabilities. Something that we haven't even touched on is the fact that the United States has also depleted a significant amount of our interceptors that we use to intercept these missiles that Iran poses such a threat with using. So I want to take you now to the fact that I ended up posting the end of that clip, right? And what I ended up saying was that Ben Shapiro's newest hire defended bombing children and then got fact-checked into the ground. Matt ended up stopped responding after one response. But what he said was, I said over 50, and the fact checker said some reports said 50 and others were a bit lower. That is disingenuous. What the fact checkers said was that it was 50 at best by some estimates, and other estimates put it much lower, not a bit lower. They specifically said much lower, Matt. I know you like to be disingenuous, and I know you love to lie about things, but that's not, everyone can look at the recording. They specifically say much lower. And we can't all gauge every estimate the same, right? The estimates that I'm bringing up and the one that I just referred to in that New York Times article is U.S. intelligence. So Matt goes on to say, that's not a dunk. Plus, you were getting smacked down the whole time. I don't know where he thinks I was getting smacked down. If he thinks that I was getting smacked down, fact check me on any of the claims I made. But he refused to do that. In fact, I was the first person to press the button. I ended up being correct. And then they ended up getting dominated in the points then after. So I put it to him. I said, U.S. intelligence puts the number much lower, not just any report or estimate. Not only is that an obvious dunk, it's hardly even a U.S. strategic achievement. Our interceptors are far more expensive and difficult to replenish and are also depleted. Starting a war just to hardly degrade conventional capabilities is a humiliating outcome from the war you ordered. Is the smacking in the room with us right now? Matt, again, did not reply. Again, Matt, do you really think a 30% reduction in Iran's missile stockpile and maybe a few other degradation of their conventional military capabilities was worth the lives of 13 U.S. servicemen, 1,600 Iranian civilians, drastic inflation that has affected everyone from the global south, pushing them into acute poverty and hurting the American working class that is already struggling, living paycheck to paycheck? You really think that any of that was worth it when everything that we've supposedly achieved through this war are just things that Iran can rebuild upon, the same way that our damaged bases, we're just going to have to spend exorbitant amount of money rebuilding and replenish our interceptors, et cetera, et cetera? It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And these people should be embarrassed. I mean, I think it's hilarious that Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire are banking on someone like Matt Nuclear to do their propaganda for them. But clearly, if this is their best bet, they're going to lose the propaganda war. And there's a reason why even Gen Z conservatives are becoming increasingly Israel critical. A big part of that is because this war in Iran that Israel and the head of Mossad and Bibi Netanyahu talked Donald Trump into has been a catastrophic disaster for the United States. It has only been in the acute interest of Israel. Nonetheless, Matt did post one of the clips from our debate, thinking that he had a dunk on me. What Matt ended up posting was that clip that you just saw where he calls me out for leaving out the fact that Ali Khamenei imposed brutal crackdowns on their people during the January and December protests. But there's something very interesting about this clip that Matt posted, and it's ironic because he calls me deceitful. He crops out the debate topic, which is why I quickly responded to him and said, that's not the debate topic. He also clips out the end where I explicitly say, that's not the debate topic. That's not why we're here to debate. We're here to debate Donald Trump and Joe Biden's record, not Ali Khamenei and Donald Trump's record, or Ali Khamenei and Joe Biden's record, right? Whether or not Ali Khamenei imposed those brutal crackdowns is something that is worth mentioning just maybe from a broad humanitarian perspective, which is why I spoke about it at the time it was happening and have continued to include it in various of the videos that I've made. But nonetheless, that's not the debate topic. But Matt Nuclear very conveniently crops out the debate topic. And you may say, maybe it wasn't deliberate, you know, maybe it was just a matter of how he styles his videos. But oddly enough, he posted 2 other clips from this same video and included the debate topic in those 2 videos. So he posted a clip in his exchange with Hunter, who was also on the video, and he posted a clip from his exchange with Mason. And in both of those videos, he included the debate topic on the top. Very clearly a deliberate choice by Matt. So what I said is, hey, Matt Nuclear, why would you crop out the top of the vid where the debate prompt is clearly comparing the record of Trump versus Biden, not Khamenei versus Trump? Trump's war of aggression on Iran has killed at least 1,600 civilians. You support that war. So if we're comparing the record of these 2 presidents, the one, and your concern is Iranian civilians, the one that has killed drastically more Iranian civilians is Donald Trump, which once again is to my point. And Matt conveniently ended up hiding my reply. How I can tell, if you go to this post, you won't see my reply. Now, if you go to my page, you'll see the reply, but if you go to the post, you won't see the reply, which is the reason why Matt conveniently hid from it. And, you know, I'm not going to bitch and moan too bad. You know, it is what it is. If he wants to be a coward and run away from the very obvious fact that he ironically deceitfully cropped out the debate topic, it is what it is. It shows how weak and pathetic these people's positions are and how insecure they are really about their own positions. Because the most confident and competent debaters, the most confident intellects within the space are going to be as honest as possible when presenting the information and the evidence. Matt, throughout our debate and throughout his engagement then after, has clearly demonstrated that he's not very confident about his own positions. He has to make adjustments of framing and not be fully honest about all of the information and details and try to win on different sorts of framings or technicalities because he's not actually confident in the positions that he holds. And I think that's sad from a guy who recently was hired by the notorious Facts Over Feelings. Well, that's all I have for everyone. If you liked my debate with Matt Nuclear, and if you like my debates in general on Jubilee, be sure to subscribe to this channel. I am primarily focused on creating short form content on places like TikTok and Instagram, but I am extending and pushing myself to create more long form content. So once again, subscribe to this channel. Thank you guys so much for listening, and drop a comment down below what you thought of our debate and what you think about this whole situation.